Okay, let's dive in. Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're getting into the really complex and often chaotic world of international business. We're focusing on this one central tension, how the theoretical efficiency of global trade is always fighting against the friction of the real world. We're talking finance, politics, and of course, culture.
And that friction is happening on a scale that is just, it's staggering. This isn't about small companies trading overseas anymore.
No, we're not.
We're talking about a level of global interdependence that fundamentally changes the power dynamics on the world stage.
Well,
And to give you a feel for that scale, there's this one fact from the sources we looked at that just really stood out. If you took Walmart's revenue and treated it like a country,
yes, the company Walmart.
just Walmart, it would be the sixth largest trading partner of China.
A single company with the economic weight of a major nation? That really puts the challenge into perspective, doesn't it? The regulatory nightmare they must face.
Yeah, it absolutely does. And because of that, our mission for you today is to leave this discussion with a much more sophisticated understanding of all these conflicting forces. Everything from the pure logic of trade theory to the inescapable and often irrational friction points from governments and culture.
So let's start with the ideal scenario, the bedrock of it all, which is the theory of international trade. It really all starts with one concept: comparative advantage. Can you break that down for us? Why is trade always a good thing, even if one country seems better at producing, well, everything?
The theory is beautiful because it's so simple. Even if one nation holds what's called an absolute advantage,
Meaning they're just more efficient at making everything.
exactly. Even then, trade is still a win-win for both countries. It's because the real gains come from specialization. You put your resources into what you do relatively best, even if someone else is technically better overall, it becomes a positive sum game.
That might sound a little academic, but we see it in action every single day. The Boeing 787 Dreamliner is a perfect example from our sources.
It really is. The final assembly is in Everett, Washington, but that's just a hub. The components are sourced from all over the world, based purely on that efficiency.
So for instance,
Well, the cargo doors are stamped made in Sweden, the lavatories come from Japan, the landing gear is from France. It's a global production model designed to maximize that efficiency.
now when we look at how different nations get to that point of efficiency, we see these wildly different paths.
Mhm.
The sources gave us a really compelling comparison between India and China.
Oh, absolutely. And that comparison is vital because it shows there's no single recipe for growth. India's path has been service-led. It's about brain power, IT services, and it's a democratic sort of bottom-up approach.
In China.
China's the opposite. It's manufacturing and investment-led. It relies on massive infrastructure spending, factory labor, and a non-democratic top-down system.
So you have this organic democratic path versus the state-controlled investment-heavy path.
Exactly. And the moment we try to measure which one is better, we immediately hit the problems with metrics like GDP or GNP.
Right, because per capita figures can hide huge regional differences. You can look at China's overall GNP, but that number hides the massive wealth gap between, say, Shanghai and the rural interior.
Not only that, but GDP just ignores entire sectors of human activity.
Like what?
Well, think about volunteer work, or subsistence farming, or the entire cash-based shadow economy. A metric that misses all of that isn't really giving you the full picture.
Which is why the sources really emphasize a different measure, the Human Development Index, or HDI. How does a more holistic measure like HDI change the view for a company?
HDI is better because it goes beyond just income. It looks at three things: a long and healthy life, education, and a decent standard of living. For a company, this is huge.
Why?
Because if a country has a high GNP but a low HDI, meaning poor health and education, your market for high-end goods is tiny and fragile. A strong HDI suggests a much more robust consumer base.
Speaking of income, let's get into the financial world. This is where the chaos really starts. Let's talk about currency exchange rates. How can they just turn corporate profits upside down on paper?
It's something called translation risk, and it directly hits financial reports. Subsidiaries have to convert their earnings back to the parent company's home currency. So if the host country's currency is weak, translating those earnings automatically shrinks the profits for the parent company. It's a massive headache.
But the official exchange rate doesn't always tell you what the money is actually worth on the street.
Yeah.
Right. This is where purchasing power parity, PPP, comes in.
Precisely. PPP is a crucial adjustment tool. It recalibrates the official rate to show you what a currency can actually buy in its home country. The sources use Thailand as an example.
Okay.
The official rate might be, say, 41 baht per US dollar, but the PPC rate is closer to 21 baht per dollar.
So why does that 20 baht difference matter so much to the listener?
Because it means the average Thai consumer can actually afford far more locally than the official exchange rate would suggest. Adjusting GNP with PPP gives a company a much, much more accurate picture of the market size. It's a reality check.
And for an example of just pure currency volatility, nothing really screams chaos like the Russian ruble crisis in the 1990s.
Oh, that was a textbook case. After decades of central planning, inflation just exploded. The exchange rate went from under 200 rubles to the dollar in 92 to over 5,000 by 1995.
That's already crippling.
And then it got worse. After the government defaulted on its debt in August 1998, the ruble's value fell by 300%.
300%.
In less than a month. It shows just how fast financial friction can wipe out all those theoretical gains from trade.
And that volatility is a perfect transition into the next part of our dive, the constraints and friction that governments intentionally create.
Right. They often use crises just like that as a justification for it.
So why do they do it? Why do governments use things like tariffs and quotas when all the theory says it harms global efficiency?
The motives usually fall into three big buckets: political, economic, and cultural.
Okay, so let's start with political.
Politically, they intervene to protect domestic jobs, that's always popular, and to preserve national security. Making sure you have a domestic supply of fuel or transport in case of a war. And sometimes they use trade restrictions to try and gain influence over smaller nations. The U.S. trade embargo against Cuba is the classic example.
But hold on a second. Isn't the Cuban embargo a perfect example of a policy that completely failed to achieve its political goals? So why do governments keep using tools that don't seem to work?
That's a crucial point. Sometimes these policies stick around not because they're effective internationally, but because they satisfy a powerful domestic political group. The motive becomes internal politics, not external pressure.
Okay, so then on the economic side, the motive is more about building for the future.
Exactly. Economically, governments protect infant industries. The idea is you shield a new domestic industry from global competition until it's strong enough to stand on its own. They also promote what are called strategic trade policies to get a first-mover advantage in new sectors like aerospace or microchips.
And then there's the cultural motive. I always find this one the most interesting, this idea of protecting a national identity.
This usually comes from a perceived threat from, well, mostly U.S. media and consumer goods. France is a great example.
How so?
French law requires radio programs to include at least 40% French content. They've even officially banned English words like bestseller?
Wait, they actually banned the phrase bestseller. That seems less like national security and more like a national obsession. Does that ever actually work?
Well, it depends on the goal. It definitely creates friction for businesses. But for the policymakers, the aim might not be to stop the influence entirely, but just to make sure that local culture has some guaranteed space to breathe.
So if those are the reasons, what are the actual tools they use? We all know tariffs and quotas.
They are the key instruments. A tariff is just a tax on a product as it enters or leaves a country. Quotas are limits on the volume of a good. And then the most restrictive tool is an embargo, a complete ban on trade.
But there's a subtler one that's often used by developing nations to try and force industrialization, the local content requirement, or LCR.
Right. LCRs are laws that say a certain amount of a good or service has to be sourced domestically. This creates huge friction for a global supply chain. It forces companies to use local suppliers who might be more expensive or less efficient.
And when this political friction really gets out of hand, it can lead to property seizure. We should probably differentiate the types of seizure.
It's vital for any kind of risk assessment. There are 3 levels. Confiscation is a forced transfer of assets with no compensation.
Worst case scenario.
Absolutely. Then there's expropriation, which is a forced transfer with compensation, but it's often way below market value. And finally, nationalization is when the government just takes over an entire industry.
Why is pure confiscation so rare these days?
Because it destroys a country's reputation with international investors for generations. They might get a short-term gain, but they sacrifice all future foreign investment, and that's just too high a price to pay.
Okay, and finally, let's talk about culture. That unseen layer of friction. The sources use the Ofsted framework, specifically the power distance dimension.
High power distance cultures, the ones that accept a lot of social inequality, really affect marketing. In these cultures, you have a very wealthy upper class whose status often comes from inheritance. So marketing luxury goods, expensive cars or yachts, can be very successful by appealing directly to that niche, reinforcing their status.
And the adaptation required can be incredibly specific. The McDonald's example in India is famous for a reason.
It's the perfect example of adaptation in action. To respect Hindu beliefs about sacred cows, McDonald's completely removed beef from the menu in India.
They serve the Maharaja Mac, I think.
Which is lamb-based, yes. And just as importantly, they prepare all the non-beef items in separate kitchen areas to avoid cross-contamination. That's a real operational cost added just because of culture.
And beyond the product, there's the importance of personal relationships. We see it with Guangxi in China, this network that helps you navigate the bureaucracy.
And in Central Europe, it's a very different kind of formality. In the Czech Republic, a foreign company needs a jednatel, a responsible person who is legally in charge and acts as the local representative. If you ignore that, you're guaranteed to fail.
So, faced with this labyrinth of conflicting forces, what do companies do? They often turn to bigger strategic moves like regional economic integration.
Right. Integration, like the European Union, is designed to reduce or eliminate a lot of those barriers we've been talking about. And the euro is the most powerful example of the payoff.
What are the main benefits of having the euro for trade inside the bloc?
It completely gets rid of exchange rate risk for deals between member nations. And it cuts down transaction costs enormously. The EU estimates the gains from that alone could eventually add 0.5% to the bloc's GDP.
But there's a serious cost to integration, and that's the loss of sovereignty.
Absolutely. The main drawbacks are political. You have the fear, which we saw with Brexit, that your country will be run by unelected bureaucrats in Brussels. The other big economic risk is something called trade diversion.
Trade diversion, how does that work?
It's when trade shifts to a less efficient producer inside the bloc, just because there are high tariffs on more efficient producers outside the bloc. So you might have been buying cheaper, better shoes from Vietnam, but once your country joins the EU, you're now pushed to buy more expensive, lower quality shoes from, say, Portugal, just because the tariff on the Vietnamese shoes is too high.
So efficiency takes a backseat to regional cohesion. Let's shift from trade to investment. Foreign direct investment, or FDI. This is the long-term commitment. How does the international product lifecycle theory explain why companies move their production abroad?
It frames FDI as a three-stage process. First is the new product stage. A company keeps production at home, close to R&D, because demand is uncertain.
Then it matures.
Right, the maturing product stage. Demand grows in other countries, so the company invests in production facilities there to cut shipping costs and get around trade barriers.
And finally, the stage that creates so much friction.
The standardized product stage. Competition gets fierce, and there's huge pressure to cut costs. So the company shifts production to low-cost developing nations. That sequence explains why long-term investment moves where it does.
What are some of the risks when a company moves to that standardized low-cost stage, besides the obvious ones?
I think the central risk is losing control of your intellectual property. When you move your manufacturing process to a low-cost nation, you're putting your core technology in a high-risk environment. Local content rules or joint ventures can lead to your tech being leaked or stolen.
And governments are, of course, heavily involved in trying to steer this FDI. What are the main tools they use to attract it?
Host countries will use financial incentives, tax breaks, low-interest loans, and big infrastructure improvements like building roads or power plants specifically for a new factory.
And the downside of that?
The downside for the host country is that it can create these bidding wars where big multinational corporations play locations against each other. And often the cost to the taxpayers ends up being more than the value of the jobs created.
And on the other side, how do governments restrict FDI that they don't want?
They mainly use ownership restrictions. They can outright prohibit investment in sensitive areas like national security, or they can mandate that foreign investors have to hold less than a 50% stake to ensure local control. They also impose really tough performance demands, like requiring a minimum percentage of local employment. That's a huge dose of friction for global HR.
So what this deep dive has really shown is that global business is this constant, dynamic balancing act. You start with the pure idea of efficiency, where comparative advantage says Boeing should source parts globally. But that ideal is constantly getting hit by the political friction of tariffs, the financial chaos of something like the ruble crisis, and the absolute necessity of deep cultural adaptation, from the Maharaja Mac to hiring a local Jednadel.
That synthesis really captures the core tension. Companies have to get that these forces are always pulling in opposite directions. And on that theme, I want to leave you with one final provocative question about global finance, specifically about the IMF.
The International Monetary Fund. Its original job was to be a kind of international bank, providing temporary help, not just handing out money.
Right. But when the IMF steps in and effectively bails out debtor countries in crisis like Mexico or Russia in the 90s, critics argue that the system is just rescuing big financial institutions and private investors from their own bad decisions.
So the core issue is what they call moral hazard.
Exactly. If the IMF is always there as the lender of last resort, does that just encourage private sector banks to exercise, well, inadequate caution when they're lending money in risky markets? Are we basically shifting the risk of speculative investment onto the global taxpayer by guaranteeing that the IMF will step in? It's a fundamental ethical challenge at the heart of the whole system.
A difficult question, and something to think about the next time you read about a government default or a major currency crisis. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive. Until next time, keep exploring and stay curious.